Hey there, Professor Zeeb here again, and welcome back into another audio-visual lecture. This time we're going to talk about a really touchy, sensitive subject which a lot of people can relate to or even personally dealing with, and that is divorce. This is one of those topics that we're going to talk about all semester long. It almost seems like we can't get away from this one because it really touches a lot of people's lives. A lot of people deal with this or know someone that is going through a divorce or has dealt with a divorce. It seems like it's almost common in our society, which is such a sad thing in my opinion. Okay, so let's go to some divorce research and we'll kind of look at some different findings and so forth. Go to our slides here. All right, so let's get into divorce. We're gonna start off with some research and just some statistics involving divorce here. And we're also gonna examine how divorce specifically affects young children, okay? All right, so let's look at some facts about divorce. Our country, it seems like it's famous for divorce. The United States has one of the highest divorce rates in the world when we compare it to other countries. So the statistics given in the textbook is 3.2 per 1,000 people in our country go through a divorce. So in other words, we found that a lot of people do go through divorce, is kind of the point with that. The good news, however, is that the numbers are showing that it has been declining since the 1980s. So some of the rates may be going down if you believe in those studies, okay? The sad thing here, however, knowing that divorce is pretty common, is that 40% of children born to married parents will experience their parents divorcing. So wow, 40% of children, which is millions of children in our country, will be going or going through their parents divorcing and having to deal and cope with that. We really think that that has trickled down to a lot of different problems. Research shows that in general, our society may have a fear of commitment, okay, which would kind of make sense and kind of links and connects to that. We may be hesitant to trust our companion's intentions. In other words, I guess the point there is if your own parents divorced and that seems kind of like a normal thing where some kind of bad situation happened where your parents split up, it may be hard for you when you become an adult to trust people or to truly go all in because you sort of understood through your own experiences that marriage is not a long-standing thing necessarily. In other words, there's always the chance that something could happen, someone could betray you. So you can imagine why that would create hesitancy and fear of commitment or even unwillingness to share your feelings with people because you don't know if you can really trust them, which is such a sad thing in my opinion, something me personally I'm not used to in my own experiences, but I'm sure a lot of people kind of share that feeling. All right, we're going to look at children in divorce, and now throughout the course, we are going to examine divorce at different age groups, including the teenage years and so on. But now we're going to look specifically at young children and how it affects them and how they're so particularly vulnerable to the effects of divorce, according to our studies. So research does show that during early childhood, youngsters are particularly vulnerable to the effects of divorce. And really one of the main reasons for that, as they're adjusting to divorce here, is that they blame themselves. So this one is a devastating one and something, as a parent, you have to be so careful to make sure your children understand if you are going through a divorce. We think that a lot of young children, because they're not really understanding how the world works, they may sort of look for inward reasons why this happened. In other words, mommy and daddy went through a divorce and this is my fault, where it had nothing to do with them. It could have been like a total adult issue that led to that. So kids often point inward and say, wow, it's my fault that this actually happened. Once again, this is probably due to cognitive deficits. Now remember, we talked about Piaget and how he believed in egocentrism of children. And that, remember, just to review, that's where they're having a hard time taking the viewpoint of other people and perspectives of others. So that may be one reason why they can't understand why mommy and daddy broke up. They may think, I did something here that created this. So they're not understanding that mommy and daddy have problems necessarily, or they think differently. Remember, it's hard for them to put themselves in the other person's shoes. So this one you got to be really careful with, because young children, you know, it's pretty common for them to blame themselves. So if it was me as the parent, I would make sure that they understand that. I would make sure I would have that talk with them that, hey, you know, mommy and daddy are having some problems here. Things aren't going according to plan, but it's not your fault. It's definitely not your fault. This is between mommy and daddy. Something happened, you know, at their level, obviously. You want to make sure they understand that they did not cause this, or that, you know, they should not be blaming themselves for this unfortunate happening, and so forth. Research also shows that divorce is linked to separation anxiety and fears of abandonment. You can understand a young child going through that, where if dad has left the picture, it may appear that he's not coming back. You know, they might not understand that dad is separated and will continue to have contact necessarily. It may seem that, wow, he abandoned me, he doesn't love me, he's never coming back. So once again, you want to make sure that your kids know this, that they can understand that this is, you know, something that mommy and dad are going through. It has nothing to do with you, and it's not your fault. Your parents are still love you, and are still going to be involved in your life. So really important message to communicate to your children, to make sure they understand that, especially if they're younger in age. Okay, so we're going to transition here. And next we're going to go to some more research involving divorce here. Okay, let's take a look. So the first point, children from divorced families show poorer adjustment than their counterparts in never divorced families. Now guys, as we go through this, remember the findings that we're discussing here are correlational in nature. I am not saying in any means that divorce causes this to happen, or people who go through a divorce are doomed in these areas. I'm looking surely at the numbers on a correlational standpoint, that we know that divorce is more highly associated with these things compared to kids who come from intact families. So please understand that as we go through this. I'm not saying cause and effect here, okay? So the research shows that children who come from divorced families, it's correlated with a lot of problems. I'm just gonna list them off here. Number one, academic problems. So on average, they don't do as well in school, which is understandable. If they're kind of dealing with that, it may affect them in terms of their schoolwork and their ability to focus, for example. Less socially responsible, studies have also found that. Less competent in intimate relationships, so maybe once they get older, into the teenage years and beyond, it may create or be associated with problems connecting and being intimate with people because they're you know, worried or hesitant of being betrayed or something like that. We know that children who come from divorced homes are more sexually active and earlier. So in other words, their initial sexual contact or experiences seem to come earlier compared to children whose family is intact, which is concerning, because that could lead to things like teenage pregnancy, STDs, so it's a health issue, dealing with adult things when they're still kids, which is concerning. So once again, another area that we see differences in. Research also shows they're more likely to abuse substances and to have low self-esteem, which kind of makes sense, because if they're depressed about a divorce and they're going through that, they may look for other ways to kind of ease the tension or find ways to cope with their problems, for example. Now, we looked at all those findings there. Keep in mind that kids who come from multiple divorce backgrounds, let's say mom's been married 3 times and has been going through all these divorces, those risk factors seem to go up with each divorce. So children who come from multiple divorce scenarios are some of our highest risk factors for those areas that we just mentioned. Okay, our next finding here. Individuals who have experienced their parents' divorce were more at risk for engaging in a lifetime suicide attempt, which obviously is very serious and very tragic here. So in other words, we have found a connection to depression, as you would probably imagine. People who go through a divorce are more likely to be depressed in adulthood. So in other words, when they were kids, their parents split up, they're more likely to be depressed as an adult if their parents divorced compared to if they were still intact. Many of the problems experienced by children from divorced homes begin during the pre-divorce period. In other words, what we're saying there is that there may be problems that are underlying the divorce which become worse as the divorce sort of progresses. So in other words, during the marital conflict leading up to the actual divorce, we see some effects here. So in other words, it may make pre-existing issues worse. Let's say we have a child who has very low self-esteem for various reasons, not necessarily related to their family situation. So they have low self-esteem, then the divorce happens, that may actually progress to major depression. So you guys kind of see that pattern there? It's almost like it's adding fuel to the fire, where it could make pre-existing problems worse because they've gone through this horrible experience of their own parents, the two people they love the most, going through a rocky divorce or kind of some volatile situation, if you would. Studies also show that if the conflict happens at age 2, so relating it to really early ages here, it may actually create delayed internal problems. So maybe initially they don't show the effects of that, but down the road it could resurface and it could create some issues that they would have to deal with. So the point is, whichever way you look at it, divorce it can be a really negative experience and have a lot of negative consequences, as we're finding in the research. All right, lastly here, children with a difficult temperament often have problems in coping with their parents' divorce. Remember, we talked about the different temperamental styles. We said there's easy, slow to warm up, and even difficult. So we know of those three, it's the difficult children that seem to have the worst transition or worst problems, worst experience in dealing with a divorce. That would make sense, because remember, these difficult children here have a really hard time adapting to change. And so going through a divorce and the aftermath of divorce could certainly consist of a big change in that child's life, where they went from 2 parents to a single parent situation, or possibly not seeing one of the parents in a long-term fashion. That may make a huge sort of drastic transitional phase that that child cannot simply cope with. So we know that the ones that, early on show that difficult temperament are probably the ones that fare the worst when it comes with divorce. Now remember, there's always exceptions to that. Does not mean it's 100% going to happen, but if we look at the numbers and the averages, it just seems like the odds are kind of stacked against difficult children in that way, because remember, their temperament is difficult to begin with, and therefore this would probably be pretty difficult for them to deal with. All right, so once again, whichever way you look at it, divorce seems to be connected to a lot of negative problems. It seems like all the studies show a lot of negative effects. Certainly good things could come out of divorce, like if it was an abusive situation where that parent needs to be, they're gone, and now that problem has been sort of erased from the child's life. It certainly could be a positive sort of thing. But once again, when we look at the studies here, it seems to be a common denominator that it's just negative, negative, negative. And we're going to kind of see that later on in the class as we talk about different ages and continue with divorce. All right, so that will conclude our short little lecture here on divorce. We will continue with this particular topic later on. Please progress to the next step in the class, and I will see you online.